it's a great pleasure that Nick has given up of his time this evening. He joins us from Hertfordshire on his family farm, and brings us the experience that he's had from a lifetime, particularly as director of the EU and Exit International Trade for National with NFU, which he's run since 2017. And Nick, I'm guessing that not even you knew we'd have such an extraordinary and rocky ride over the last 3 years to where we are now, post-Brexit, finally. What a long and extraordinary period of time, but you navigated a remarkable period. And the NFU has never been more emboldened, I suspect, really, or given more significance to its members in terms of direction. It's a hugely difficult and interesting time. So I thought this evening, everybody, what we would do is to really just hear it straight from someone who's been at the coalface of the transition from CAP into the ELM, to put together some of the facts and the ideas, framework it for your thoughts and consideration. And obviously, the background to all this is the series of talks that we've enjoyed about what we are calling active environmentalism. So it's really how the transition in this way has begun to bring the environment, and I think I'm right to say that, is under the policy of for public good, is, in fact, I noticed that it's public goods, plural, which I want to talk about with Nick later on, and how that has brought itself up the scale. And it's a lovely concept, but is it a lovely reality? Nick, I suspect you more than anybody will be able to help us with that. So thank you for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, Johnny. And yeah, you're right. It's been a sort of long trudge over the last 4.5 years to get where we were, and actually very frustrating, because there's been all these conversations about how we, having taken back control, what we do with that control, particularly around agriculture and environmentalism and where those two things meet. But it hasn't really moved on very much in that 4.5 years. It was quite interesting, actually, when I took on the role with the NFU a few months after the referendum. They created a team to look after everything that came out of Brexit. And the debate then was when Theresa May was going to trigger the Article 50 mechanism, which would set 2-year clock running. So everyone was thinking in terms of 2 years. And lots of people said to me at the time, well, that's a bit of a stupid move by you. You've only got a job for 2 years. And I sort of ruefully smiled and said, I think it's going to be a bit longer than that. And I think it's going to be a lot longer than that. This sort of, some of the issues arising, I think, are going to be never ending. But look, I wanted to, as you said, just sort of talk a bit about the current policy environment for land management and agriculture in the UK, in particular England. I think it's an important point we sometimes miss is agriculture is a devolved issue, and actually the policy approach will be different in the devolved nations. And when we're talking about ELMs and public money for public goods, that is an English policy, and Wales, Scotland and Ulster may do something similar, but they may do something different. But we have this sort of, we're at this juncture now, I guess, where we're deciding what to do with our newfound sovereignty when it comes to policy. But before I dive into that, and I also want to talk a bit about trade policy, because that is really important, has a really big impact, often overlooked, on how we look after the land and produce our food. But before we do that, I thought it'd be useful sort of to take a step back and think a little bit about the junction, the nexus between farming and environmentalism and looking after the land. Because actually it's important that we think about the context of this. In particular, I think there's sort of two important questions we just need to make sure we're answering, which is, does the land need to be farmed at all? Actually, we've some of us got great visions for biodiversity, wildlife, the environment, etc. Why not just pursue those? You know, why should farming come into it at all? Secondly, who's responsible for achieving some of these visions and these aims? Yeah. So it won't surprise you, you know, coming from where I am, both as a farmer and working with the NFU, that I do think it's important that the land is used for producing food. Globally, we have a growing global population who need to be fed. It's interesting, I was born in the mid-70s. Back then, the global population was about 4 billion. It's now almost 8 billion. So in the course of my life, the amount of people on Earth has doubled in that short time frame. In fact, if you go back just 100 years, there was less than 2 billion people on the planet. It's quadrupled in 100 years. And it's predicted to continue to rise. So we're nearly at 8 billion now. It's expected that we're almost approaching 10 billion by 2050 and possibly 11 billion at the end of the century, at which point, as you say, it begins to tail off and probably come down. But that's an awful lot of mouths to feed. It actually, I think it's more amazing if you look at it on a daily increase basis, which is 220,000 more people on planet Earth every day. That's a town the size of Luton. It's every day, 220,000 people. I mean, we look at these awful statistics, and they are awful around the pandemic at the moment, and almost 2.5 million people have now died globally from coronavirus, which is obviously a tragedy. But that amount is replenished in less than 2 weeks on the current global population rises. So this is a massive challenge, how we feed people. And it's a difficult challenge. And that's why there is this tension, I think, between the environment, looking after our landscapes, looking after wildlife, but recognizing you've got to produce food as well to feed a growing global population. Now, it's not just about producing food, is it? I mean, we've got to do better at reducing waste, much too much waste. We've got to be better at distributing food around the world, although that's not easy. But we know there are some parts of the world, us included, where we've got lots of food. We eat too many calories probably, and there are other parts who don't. So you've got to balance that out a little bit. There's obviously lots of discussion about adapting diets to make those more sustainable. Again, very tricky. You've got China, for example, massive increasing middle class there, who want to start eating more meat and don't take very kindly to the West, who've done that for hundreds of years, telling them actually they need to move to plant-based diets. So, you know, maybe a nice idea, but it's going to be very difficult to meet in practice. So ultimately, the food production bit is going to remain important. Certainly with the population exploding, I don't think we should be moving to a situation where we are producing less food. What we've got to do is actually be more efficient about the way we produce that food. So impact less on the environment in the way we do it. So I think there's strong, important arguments there why we need to be producing food on the land, and why there is a tension between looking after the land and producing food. It's not a tension that's unresolvable, but it's a tension nonetheless. Now, we kind of bring that back to the UK. There is an argument. In fact, this was an argument that was espoused by politicians sort of 20 odd years ago, that we didn't really need to worry about farming and producing food in the UK. Fine, people needed to eat, but actually we're a rich country, we can import food, and that's what we can do. And in a way, that's quite an attractive option. You go, well, if that's the case, then we can manage the landscape and the environment in the way that we want without having to worry too much about farming. But I think there are lots of problems with that argument. Firstly, food security. I think it's quite important as a country, and we've been reminded of this quite a lot in the last year with the pandemic, but it's important that we can produce at least a decent proportion of the food that we eat. Not all of the food we eat. I think you don't want to go too far. That would be silly as well. You need a balance so that you don't become a cropper, but you need to have a pretty sufficient amount of production on your own shores to ensure you've got good position in food security and you can meet your requirements for food. Then you've got issues around sustainability, like air miles. Do we want to be flying food across the globe to feed us? Generally, no. I think we want to be eating as locally as we can, although again, can be a complicated issue. It's not as simple as food flown over here has a higher environmental footprint. Sometimes it doesn't, especially if you're using, for example, greenhouses or bother, like in the UK, to grow certain vegetables. So it's not open and shut that, but generally, all things being equal, it's obviously better to be producing and eating locally.
That's the case for security and standards, I suspect, isn't it, in terms of an argument for justifying food production in the UK and on the landscape. I think that's good. So interesting. Arguably, potentially an argument about doing it better, I suppose. And are we a sort of a leading capacity in that area, or where do we sort of figure on that spectrum
in terms of domestic
our ability to
food?
produce? I suppose, as you're itemizing, I think really well describing the reasons why we shouldn't be unrealistic about our aspirations for putting large parts of the landscape to flora and fauna, just for the sort of esoteric sense of it. But farming has this real necessity. So it obviously is a question that's been addressed is, well, can we do it but better? And what is this, this tension point? I'd love to return to that with you in a moment as well.
Yeah, I mean, so this is exactly the question. If you are satisfied that you've got a good justification for producing food on your own shores, and I think there are a couple of other important issues actually, like for example, the ethical aspect of requiring developing countries, for example, to feed the developing world. I'm deeply uncomfortable with that notion. I think we should be doing what we can to feed ourselves, not requiring countries around the world that are increasingly struggling actually to produce food with climate change, etc., relying on them. Interestingly enough, actually, the UK is a very good place to produce food globally. It's a maritime climate, temperate, great place for producing grass, very good in some parts of the country for producing crops. I mean, our yields are world beating. It is, if you kind of picked a few places around the globe, Northwest Europe, Britain would be up there as some of the best places to produce food. So it seems to me that it's totally wrong in that situation to then pass up that opportunity and instead expect other countries around the world to produce the food for us. We should be producing a good degree of the food that we eat. But of course, we know that then has the potential to have an impact.
This is I guess a question in that case of how, really, isn't it? So this must be at the forefront of the farming industry's mind, I guess, how and at what price?
Yeah. So this sort of brings you then to the current kind of policy environment. And I think there are two important policy areas that interact here, and you have to get right together. And I'm talking about policy environment. It is, of course, beholden on us as individuals or individual farm businesses or the broader food industry as well to take responsibility for this as well. I'm not saying, certainly not that government needs to sort this out, but policy is really important, particularly when you've got a food system in the UK which is very good at providing cheap food. In fact, only Singapore and the US pay less for their food as a proportion of their income. Food in the UK is very cheap. Now, that's not to say there are not families out there, people out there who struggle to afford food and struggle to eat well. Clearly they do. But that's not really an issue with the way food is priced in the UK. That is about incomes and poverty and austerity. What we have here is a food system which is really built around providing cheap food. So food is cheap. Farmers' margins are pretty slim, as many people I'm sure on the call will know. Anybody who's involved in farming knows that it's not a gravy train at all. And there are people in the middle who are probably making a bit more money. But what this means is that it would be lovely, and a lot of people say, well, all we need to do is to make people pay more for their food, and then actually, what is the real price of food? And that's the way to kind of solve this. You pay farmers properly for the food, consumers pay a proper price for their food, and then farmers can farm to higher standards, they can shoulder the costs of more sustainable production, etc. But in truth, that is going to be almost impossible, I think, to implement. So how do you persuade people to pay more?
Yeah, and I was going to say, so do you think farmers would farm in more, in those ways, more environmental ways, if the money was there to justify it? You're saying that instinctively they would?
Well, absolutely. I mean, they produce for the market, but ultimately, farmers tend to be price takers rather than price makers. It's the structural nature of the business, especially if you've got to shift your produce pretty quickly. So that is I think part and parcel of farming. But the point the question there is right, which is the need for farmers for there to be a business case for them, essentially, to farm in a certain way. And this is where we then come into the policy bit. So you've got two kind of areas at the moment which interact. First, you've got what we call domestic agricultural policy, so farm subsidies, farm support, however you want to term it, but what's replacing the cap and what are farmers paid to do. Secondly, and mustn't lose sight of this, there's our broader trade policy. What is the environment in which you're asking those farmers to actually compete in a business sense? And you have to be very careful here, because there is a risk that what we've got coming down the line is an agricultural policy, a domestic policy that incentivizes and rewards farmers for high levels of production, alongside a potentially quite high regulatory baseline, higher standards being imposed, which make it just more costly, more expensive for farmers to produce food. Now, they might get rewarded for that sufficiently, or they might not. It really depends on how much money government is willing to put into that system. But if you do that, if you are asking farmers to wear more costs in producing food, and the market isn't rewarding them, as I said, it's going to be very difficult to persuade the market to pay more. Yes, for some of us, we might be comfortable going and paying that little bit extra for organic, that little bit extra for free range, etc. I'm afraid the data shows that 90% plus of the UK population primarily buys on price. They buy, and that's understandable. Budgets are tight, but you've got that on the one hand. On the other hand, if you are also liberalizing trade, doing trade deals with countries like Australia, US, New Zealand, very impressive, efficient agricultural producers and exporters, and you are encouraging imports from those countries into the UK market, where they will compete pretty effectively with UK producers, you've got two policies there which don't meet up at all. You've got a domestic policy pushing in one direction, a trade policy pushing another. You're asking farmers to find ways of competing on price, producing at a lower cost, but your domestic policy is asking them to take on extra costs. And this is a very real risk. This is sort of potential of where we are going with our agricultural policy on one hand and our trade policy on the other. And what does that mean for how we look after the environment, how we look after the landscape? Well, it could mean a number of things. Firstly, you run the risk of undermining farming here, so that actually you basically just reduce the amount of food that we're producing in the UK. What that then means is who's looking after the land. If it's no longer farmed, you're going to have to pay armies of civil servants to manage it. And remember that actually, at least 37% of the land is tenanted. So there's a huge amount which is not owner occupied, it's not managed by the landowner. And indeed, even for most farmers, they don't have sort of spare cash, disposable income to make losses on farming and still put money into exactly. So you've got your challenge there. You then also got the bigger issue, which is you end up just exporting your food consumption. You're actually relying more on food produced overseas, where you don't have any control on the standards that food is produced to. So you might be saying here, let's develop a policy that improves animal welfare, improves environmental protection, pays farmers to deliver public goods. But actually, if you've got less farmers doing that, you're going to be importing food where none of that applies necessarily, unless the governments of those countries are doing the same thing. But that's completely out of our hands. So you're actually sort of almost incentivizing lower standard production, and that is a genuine problem. Now the government will say that is not what we're doing. Don't worry, and as they have said for the last few years, don't worry, we're going to have this wonderful new environmental land management scheme, but at the same time we're going to do trade deals, but we won't let that undermine our farming. In practice, that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do if you want to do both those things.
I think you're right in the sense that if you're negotiating trade deals, things are on the table, and until those trade deals are settled, then options are open. You can't say with certainty which way you stand. And I do accept. So I framework your summation as being the concern with potential double standards of imports coming in against our own production, which is notionally, I would suggest, slightly higher in the cost per unit compared to other competitors, even though, as you say, as a country, we've got the capacity to pay slightly more. So it's an interesting sort of dilemma, and I think I'm right that the ELM is still out for tender, I suppose, if that's the right phraseology, for 7 years worth of thrashing around in the way that you're describing. But I wanted to just, I suppose, because it's an easy document to start with. It's a devil when you get into detail, because its concept, broadly speaking, I think, is that money will be available not just for management of land, but actually management of land in an environmentally secure way. So I guess this is all still new territory, but potentially it opens up avenues for farming which may not have been there before. I was thinking in particular of things like carbon, which is something that we're now very aware that, to quote Bill Gates, there's only two numbers in the room. One is 51 billion and one is 0. And so somehow we've got to put all that back in the ground. Now, farming might have a very big role to play in that. I was wondering.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, to sort of start at the beginning, I guess we've had just last year what's called the Agriculture Act, which is the legislation that paves the way for this kind of new revolution in farming in the UK. And so that basically sets out in law that the government can pay farmers, provide financial assistance to farmers for delivering public goods. It's fairly broad framework. It's what we call an enabling bill, not much in it, but it provides that legal framework. So public goods are essentially anything that the market won't deliver itself. So it is things like biodiversity gain. It could be things like flood alleviation schemes, for example, certainly carbon mitigation or alleviation schemes, all sorts of things like this. Renewable energy, some of those bits will be within it. There are some things which are kind of grey area, like soil, really important issue, soil health, soil quality, restoring that, because it's not, in a sense, not really a public good. Actually, if you own your farm, you basically own the soil. It's a resource and an asset for you to use, and you have an interest in making sure that it's productive. Nevertheless, I think actually we generally see it as being important to find ways of incentivizing better soil management, better soil health, etc. So all of this is kind of in the mix, and the government is now beginning to set out actually how these future schemes will work. So at the moment, we have still have the sort of the back end of the old cap schemes, which essentially are what we call direct payments. Farmers just receive payments on the basis of the land that they farm. Those are being swept away over 7 years, as you say. And in that 7-year period, the new system will come in. Now, hopefully it will do as sort of what you've just described there, Johnny. It will incentivize and reward farmers for more sustainable models of production. And there's every reason it will do that. But there's a few things it needs to get right. Firstly, it needs to be resourced properly. As we said, this is livelihoods for farmers. If there's not enough money in it, then they're not going to do it because they have to earn a living. And actually, what's the alternative? Well, it might not be stuff we like. They might just, as I say, be going then toe to toe with those Australian farmers and those US farmers. There's many very good farmers in Australia and US, by the way. I'm not sort of denigrating them, but it's a different type.
They are efficient.
It's a different type of farming, and it would require our farmers to farm in a different way if they're going to compete against them. But if there's not enough in the public schemes, then that may well be what they have to do. So it needs to be sufficiently resourced, and that's potentially going to require even more than the existing system, because at the moment it's essentially it's money for the land you farm, whereas this is going to be money for delivering something which is going to come at a cost. So the farmer's going to have to wear additional costs to deliver these public goods. It's going to have to get more than the income it forgoes for doing that. So it could be quite costly. Yeah. Secondly, and I think this is really important, it can't just be about environmental performance or public goods in isolation. It has to be still about farming and food production, and for the reasons that I set out at the beginning. This is actually a great opportunity to, we've all got in our head a sort of vision of actually how farming can be more sustainable, more environmental, higher welfare, etc. But if you forget the food production bit, then you're going to miss that opportunity, and you might encourage some landowners to manage their, estates, their land, their farms in very nice ways, but regardless of whether they're producing food or not. And if we're going to, that, as I said, has problems that we just may stop as a country producing enough food, which is a problem in its own right. But also you may incentivize some farmers to go completely the opposite way and just chase production. So actually what you want to do here is find ways of saying, these are more sustainable practices, and to give the government their due, that is the language they're talking in as well. They are recognizing that, but it's not necessarily easy. It's not a straightforward thing to do, particularly as you need to make it as kind of simple. I don't want to say farmers are simple, but you need to keep it simple. You need to, make sure that they can sign up to it and do it.
I think the word I would use is convincing, in the sense that if you, and I know farmers more than anybody have long-term cycles, that the argument to shift has got to be compelling to justify it. Otherwise, as you say, it's going to look like risk, and risk is never a good element to introduce. But I suppose I was thinking about this interesting dynamic that's going on, because a lot of companies now are starting up thinking about ways of, well, to put it another way, in our world, in the art world, we've begun to think about the aesthetics of landscape very differently. So things we thought were beautiful, but have turned out to be slightly environmentally challenging or actually damaging, have sort of shifted off the plate, and we look at it with a slightly different lens. And I wondered whether farming and farmers were perhaps looking at their assets now in slightly different ways, and that opportunities, which is the wonderful evolution that our species have, that great thing we all share in common, is seeing opportunities come up that weren't there before. And I wondered whether these sort of moments were making people think, well, actually, I've got something in that dead bit of land that really could be of value, either to lock in carbon or to hold back water, or there's a new way of rotating crops. And so it's a really, some of you want to know.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and you're basically right. I think there are opportunities coming down the line which maybe weren't really there before, particularly relating to climate change and carbon. Actually, the NFU, we've now got a commitment to try and get farming in the UK to net zero by 2040, and that's pretty ambitious. And there's going to be a few different aspects to achieving that, but that is certainly a sort of quite a new aspect and there are opportunities that farmers are looking at. But actually, a lot of this, firstly, there's nothing new under the sun. It's quite interesting that a lot of the techniques and approaches that farmers are talking about now, minimal till, less ploughing, for example, generally, cover crops, grazing, mixed, moving back to mixed farming in many ways, actually. That was all, that's how it used to be. It used to be. And so there's a lot of it's quite, it's rediscovering things, but trying to rediscover them in a way that that can be efficient. And that's the important thing, I think. It's about efficiency. And we often talk about productivity, and people don't like that. It sounds like you're just saying we've got to produce more food, just kind of keep producing. It's not. It's about efficiency. So it's getting more outputs from less inputs, producing more with less impact. And I think, farmers do sort of respond to the signals they're given, both by the market and by government. And I think it would be fair to say that after the war, and for a few decades after that, generally the type of farming that we pursued in the UK was focused just on production, and its environmental impact wasn't great. But that's because we were very nervous about what had happened, and we needed to produce food, and they did the job. They did the job they were asked. But I do think actually in the last 20 years or so, things have changed quite significantly. A lot of people denigrate the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. It's very lazy. I hear a lot of kind of comments from politicians and the awful CAP, which was awful. We're going to get rid of that, and we've got this lovely new shiny system. Firstly, I think they should be very careful about that, because experience shows the new shiny system might not be quite as shiny and work quite as well as they hope. But secondly, the CAP certainly had bad aspects, but it had good aspects as well. And one of those were environmental schemes it introduced, going back a while now. So most farmers in the UK will have been involved in some sort of environmental stewardship scheme funded by the CAP over the last 10, 20 years. And even the most basic schemes, which had huge amounts of sign up, are where farmers will have put in field margins around all of their fields. They would have taken out kind of difficult field corners, because beforehand they just plowed it up and planted it, whatever. But actually they looked at it and thought, it's not that productive, that bit of the field. It's not that useful. I'll take it out, go over to a grass ley or to a wildflower meadow, whatever it might be, planting wild bird seed mixes, doing all sorts of fairly simple things. And, looking at their farm with a kind of dual lens. So saying, yes, how do I farm it, produce food from it, but also which bits of it can I turn over to the environment and do better stuff for the environment through it. Now, we can have lots of conversations, and there are lots of debates out there about how effective some of that has been and what the results have been. And some results very positive, others maybe less so. But I think that misses a really important aspect, which is it's changed behavior of farmers. I think your farmer now, and your sort of maybe younger generation farmer, thinks about farming, as I said, with that dual kind of lens in terms of its environmental impact and what they can do for the environment, as well as simply producing food, maybe in a way that previous generations didn't, because they weren't actually encouraged to. So I don't think we're now in a position of some massive kind of overhaul or revolution in the way farmers are looking at their farms. I think it's an evolution. I think it's, actually the opportunity just to kind of move to the next level, particularly with kind of climate change challenges.
That sounds like a farmer talking never ever I heard one. Evolution, the word revolution would turn anyone up. But equally, I think, if you do take that 20-year time frame, and you're right, it's interesting. Things like the environment were kind of loosely on our agenda. They're probably in a sort of to-do list somewhere around, kind of 3 or 4 inches further down. It must get round to focusing on the environment. I think, we're now in a common core. One of the reasons why we're together on these sort of talks is because we're sort of thrashing out what the future might need to be almost in a more radical sense, really, to make changes. Because I think the sort of sense of urgency has probably ramped up a bit, and we've seen it in we've seen it in climate, and that has a very real effect on livelihoods as well. So it's sort of, I suppose, given the sort of platform we have tonight, I wondered if you were there with a wand and could really instruct everybody and say, right, tomorrow, guys, you're all doing this, where you would be steering people to make radical change.
Yeah, it's.
you might say, I hate the idea of it.
No, I mean, not at all. No, I don't think that's right. I mean, I think, look, I mean, it's to a degree, it's words. I mean, radical change for some might just be evolution for others. And I think, I mean, I'd be nervous because farming does move on you know, longish timescales. And even if you, for example, you want to go into conversion and turn your farm from a conventional farm into an organic farm, you know, that is a process of a few years. If you decide to move your farm from, you know, conventional, what we've been doing over previous years, to a kind of min-till or even no-till system where you're not ploughing up the land, you know, that is going to take a few years to bed in if you start getting a return for that. And that's a difficult economic equation to face. You've got to decide that you can weather that transition in all of those situations. So kind of radical change is a bit alarming, but the motive for change, I think, is absolutely there. So, and I think it's already happening. As I say, I would say the way that a lot of farmers are farming even now today looks quite different from how it looked even 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. And most of the farmers I speak to, you know, they are looking at all of these options. You know, actually, they don't anymore look at the way of, right, I've got 500 acres. How do I farm every single last, you know, square centimetre of that and crop it and get something off it? They're actually thinking more long term, more holistically. Yeah, actually, maybe I will put over those fields to you know, green cover over the winter, or you know, take it out of production, or graze it, or whatever. Just, you know, put a grazing into the rotation. All sorts of things. All of which has a benefit. You know, that'll reinstall soil health. It'll, you know, these are things which are doable. But there are some other, just to quickly say, they're actually a really important part of this. And something which I think is quite tricky is that research and development and technology are part of this solution. Lots of these new ways of doing things have come about because we've researched them, we've looked at them, and we've decided actually, you know, there are different ways of doing things, but they require science quite often. Indeed, there might be some technologies we feel deeply uncomfortable about, not necessarily me, but some feel deeply uncomfortable about, which might have some of the opportunities we need to think honestly about. So we talk about gene editing, for example, in plant breeding. It's not quite GM, the old sense, the kind of Frankenfood stuff, but it is, you know, editing the genes of plant varieties to, and many people feel uncomfortable with that. But you could find by doing that, you get plant varieties which are much more resilient to water stress, much more resilient to disease, so they require less pesticides, for example, which may even require less fertilizer. These sorts of things. I mean, that could be quite radical. You could get those plant varieties bred and on market within a few years. That could be quite radical. But are we kind of ready to have that sort of discussion? You know, are people willing to sort of see the benefits that technology brought into farming? And people don't necessarily like the idea of farming technology kind of meeting, but you know, maybe that's
an interesting time to pick up that point. And I think you're really right to. I want to just go back and acknowledge one thing, which I always think is kind of never said enough, which is really that so often farmers, if you want someone to really understand the landscape, ask the farmer, because they spend more time looking at it than anybody else. So always wary about kind of top-down policy, coming in, because there's people there. But to continue on this track of radicalism, or sort of change, in quick step. It's interesting because now, probably more than ever, because of this COVID period, we have sort of fallen back in love with science, because we've sort of dropped it, really, hadn't we? I think in favour of other methodology, but now we trust it again, and I wonder whether that might have an impact on the kind of progress of farming as we do face these realities. And so it might be a good time to sort of merge those two languages again.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, actually, and it's particularly interesting because I think nearly all the vaccines which are in development or have now on market have all been developed through gene editing. So we are, absolutely. So we are, as a society, benefiting hugely from it in that sense. I'm not sure. I'm sort of skeptical about whether there'll be a sudden shift in kind of attitudes towards science. I do think there is greater acceptance, thankfully, of expertise than maybe there has been recently, and I think that is important. And maybe what will happen, which is again will be important, is people just sort of not leap to conclusions, and actually where there are people making scientific arguments and justifications for certain things to listen and to see. But you know, I think it's you know, people. It's a tricky one, because food is so important. This is the other thing. You know, our environment, we see it as being natural, and I can go on for a long time about what we mean by natural or not natural. I think that's a problem, actually. But you know, people have an idea of, you know, that's the environment, it's natural, and food is something we put in our own bodies. It's something we eat, and so there is always going to be a challenge, I think, about the role of technology and science when it comes to both our environment and food. But the one thing as a race, as a species, we have been absolutely incredible at. The reason why we're here is because we innovate. We don't always get it right. In fact, the human, you know, the story of humanity, the story of our progress has essentially been extraordinary innovation and occasionally going down wrong avenues and learning from that, and then reversing and going up the next one and keeping to innovate and to overcome the challenges that we have faced through innovation and generally through science and technology. So I am really kind of nervous about, you know, sort of total approaches which reject kind of technology and think we should sort of revert to something else. It's not to say we won't make mistakes, because that is just what happens. In fact, you can't proceed without mistakes, but you've got to make sure those are as minimal as possible and that you correct them as quickly as possible. But we do need to proceed. And so I do think it's a really interesting debate and question, the role of science and technology in all of this, because it can provide solutions. As I say, if you want to use less pesticides, then let's think about how we have plant varieties which are more resistant to diseases and so need less pesticides.
I think it'll be interesting to see which way that develops. And I wondered if I could steer us towards such a good point talk about things getting wrong. Isabella Tree, who was here 2 weeks ago, we were talking about food production, obviously, and land management. But actually, the point which I think is relevant to this moment is just to track back onto that question of food waste, which is probably one of the and you know, as a group, the body, you must see it more clearly than anybody else where that waste lies, because that's an easy fix. I mean, if you use the phrase low-hanging fruit, you know, those are the ones which seem to be going to waste at the moment if it's not being used. Where should we focus on that, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, it does sort of feel that it's a sort of low-hanging fruit, but I think it sort of proves itself to be more difficult than we realise. I mean, I think a lot of it starts at home, actually, and I think I'm certainly guilty of it. I'm sure lots of us are, where actually we just buy too much food. We you know, and that then is a pull on the retailers and the shops. They provide it in the way. There's an aspect of that about waste which often gets overlooked, which is our pickiness for how we want our food presented in the shops, and we want everything round and perfect and the right colour, means that the retailers are very picky with farmers. And so actually there's a lot of waste which happens before it even gets into the shops. You know, stuff that just doesn't meet spec, basically. You know, and now you have got a little bit of movement around sort of wonky veg and things like that, which is good, but it's pretty minimal. I mean, I do have to say the retailers have a lot of responsibility for sorting this out. To give them their due, they are aware of that, and there are lots of sort of initiatives going on. But ultimately, still, they are hugely competitive. They fight like tigers against each other to undercut each other and to win market share and to give consumers nice, shiny stuff at the lowest possible price. And that's basically what it always comes back to. And that ultimately, I'm afraid, means waste. And that is where a lot of the waste in the system basically is.
This is an interesting, because this, you know, goes back to my point earlier about aesthetics, in the sense that kind of we're sort of trained to like our carrots this big and that's great, and the rest of it and orange, and that's just our head. Your mouth will tell you something very different. And so, shifting people's kind of comfortableness, if you like, embracing oddity, embracing the unkempt, and the rest, is sort of, or I suppose, unhooking from perfection would be a way to do that. And it's interesting, really, in a way that, for reasons that you will understand better than me, that you are sitting in such a blockchain with the the big retailers, because every other industry so far, if the internet's done nothing for us, it's put us all directly in touch with the manufacturers and the makers, and the middleman is the guy who's been kicked into the long grass, to carry on the analogy.
I think, I mean, we've got quite a, not quite unique, but a very distinctive retail sector in the UK. Very competitive, some big players, hugely sophisticated actually. The way that the food retail system works in the UK. I mean, you just think about how quickly stuff is shifted around the country onto shop shelves, the range of choice that we have as consumers, and as I said much earlier on, the prices that we pay for it, which are pretty good, and actually it's that convenience which they've leapt upon. So I think that the tricky thing is to sort of take a step back and view the UK through the eyes of all 65 million people who live here and shop here. There's a vast range of different behaviours, but if I'm being straight with you, Johnny, you and I probably are not typical of many of those. And the shopping behaviour, it has changed a little bit in recent years. It's obviously certainly changed a bit over the last year. But generally, people still like convenience, and they can go to the supermarkets and get pretty much everything they need for the week. In fact, often now, one of the shifts there has been is people less shop for go and do a weekly shop, and they shop 2 or 3 times a week and just go and pick up the sort of stuff they need fresh for 1 or 2 days. But it's still there. The supermarkets have taken these positions. There are obviously people coming in and challenging them, the discounters like Aldi and Lidl, some interesting guys doing direct to doorstep selling, which many of people on the call probably know, but that's it's a small slice of the cake.
It is a small slice, and you're right, and you're also right to say, well, gosh, some people would be more willing and able to explore it, but they are valid. I mean, it's a big part of our sort of area here is these local produced farm milk stocks where you can literally go to bottles and fill it up. I mean, I don't see why that isn't something that could be rolled out to any part of the country, or direct selling in that way. They seem to be a huge success, and people do pay more for it. So a lot of the questions are coming through here, which I should pick up on, are very much along these lines. Is like, if it was more expensive, wouldn't we waste less? It's a fair point. And then if it's too cheap, if you valued it more, you wouldn't throw it away. But I think so. But that perhaps reflects our demographic. But nonetheless, the point is valid, really, isn't it? Is that I think someone in that middle ground, perhaps who's either the inventive farmer or someone who's working with the farmer, could do more to break the cycle, I suppose, maybe.
I think it's a sort of perfect world, which is going to be difficult to achieve. This is why I think actually policy is so important here, government approach to this, because if the market won't sort it out, and it's, as I say, I agree with this, and I've had so many people say, if we could only get people to pay more, that would be one of the solutions. How do you get people to pay more? How do you convince the single mum in our housing estate in Liverpool with 7 kids that she should be paying more when she can barely probably get by on what she's got? I love your example about the kind of milk hubs, and actually sort of local food hubs generally, I think are a really interesting idea and great. Personally, I think they're fantastic. But how do you provide one of those for 10 million people in London? You know, the supermarkets, like them or not, actually, you know, they exist for a reason, because they've actually streamlined and sophisticated the process of getting food, not just from farms in the UK, but from all over the world, onto people's high streets and actually onto the, you know, into the van, onto their doorstep incredibly effectively. And what we're sort of seeing as a solution here is to sort of persuade people to move away from that efficiency, to make life a little bit harder for themselves and a little bit more expensive. That's a pretty hard sell. You know, we can try it, we can push away, but it's a hard sell. So what's the alternative? Because I don't, you know, this is it. It's not well, so therefore it's a busted flush. We're just going to have to live with it. What I think needs to happen, as I say, is how you work out the policy that means that farming across the UK is incentivized to be sustainable, so that farmers can produce in a higher cost, more sustainable way and still provide the supermarkets and therefore the public with affordable food at the prices that they want. And how do you do that in a way that doesn't mean they got competition coming in from overseas that wipes them out? Well, you make sure your trade policy manages that. There are some very interesting, you want sort of radical ideas, some interesting radical ideas around that as well. For example, about carbon accounting and carbon border taxes. If we're going to encourage our farmers to go carbon neutral, if we're going to encourage them not just to use less carbon in their production, but also to capture carbon, then they shouldn't be competing against food coming in that doesn't have to meet those requirements as well. And the way you do that is by taxing food at the border as it comes in, traded in, imports, if they are not meeting the same carbon requirements. This is, in theory, a fantastic idea, because it then incentivizes them to do the same. The UK is essentially a global leader, and showing the world how it's done, and everybody is trading on a fair basis. Unfortunately, when we look at how you actually do this in practice, it's really quite tricky. Not impossible, but it's quite tricky. You have to kind of find a way of carbon accounting, demonstrating how much carbon you're using, etc. But it's, you know, that's a sort of, you know, these are kind of radical and interesting ideas that
do you think your members are ready for that sort of change?
I think I think yes. I mean, because if you do that, and this is really important and interesting, actually, there's an opportunity there for UK farmers, which is, look, climate change is a massive challenge for the whole world. At some point, we've all got to wake up to that, and everybody's got to start producing and consuming in a more sustainable way. So why don't British farmers, who've actually got a bit of natural advantage on some of this stuff, you know, as I say, we can actually produce quite efficiently in a carbon-friendly way. We've got lots of great pasture land. The greenhouse gas emissions from UK livestock is about 2.5 times less than the global average. You know, we've got some advantages there. So not only can you kind of be a pioneer and say that this is kind of how we should do it, but also if you're leveling the playing field, you can actually have a marketing advantage. You are producing this stuff, and people want it, people want to buy it, and so you're also selling it as well. So I think 100% that they're up for it, but we've got to kind of get out front. That's the point. Actually, we need to sort of be moving in this direction now.
Active environmentalism. That's exactly the.
That's the one. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. I suspect, you know, it had all the advantages, and certainly we're not short of any of the ingenuity either in the UK here, and certainly not in the NFU with your minds running it as well. So Nick, thank you very, very much. I was conscious that in this conversation we've covered some really important points, and it's interesting how I sort of have tracked back onto that question, I suppose of farming carbon, for want of a better phrase. And I think it's really important. It's actually also really refreshing, because we've talked a lot about sustaining wildlife. I think it's also been really useful to hear, you know, your points about sustaining farming as well, and food provision, and the basic, you know, core role of farmers business. It's been fantastic, Nick. Thank you very, very much. And I'm conscious also we've got a huge amount of people here who have asked about a whole range of topic actually, but I think I want to go on a very good one that Bruce here has asked actually, which is excellent. It's the average age of the farmer in the UK is 59. I take that on good knowledge. I think I will say that's it. How is the industry going to get new talent in to drive the skills and creativity to respond to the revolution in technology? So the working assumption is that anyone in old age is an absolute technophobe, and I take from that. But yeah, so young minds, fresh ideas, and the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's one which comes around a lot because farming's age profile is old. I mean, as in older than other sectors of the economy. I can't remember what the average. There is a figure which shows the average age of farm business people who run farm businesses with others, and it is at one end of the spectrum. But that's often because they're family farms as well. There'll often be others involved within the business. So I think the figures get a bit skewed by that. It tends to be, the parent who is the head of the business, and therefore that it's their age which gets attached to it. But it is a challenge, and it's something which kind of comes around, as I said, a lot. I think even in the Agriculture Act debates last year in Parliament, there were lots of discussions about how you encourage new entrants into farming, particularly because one of the ways it used to happen was through things like county council farm tenancies, and those are being massively reduced when they're sort of selling off land, which is a great shame. So you've got kind of these challenges, how you get new entrants into farming. Ultimately, I think one of the problems is about how farms themselves and farm families deal with succession. And a lot of the issues arise because, how do I kind of put this sensitively? That the incumbent clings on a bit too long, and it doesn't exist in other sectors. Farming is a family business quite often, so it does exist there. And actually having the conversation, and this is what you hear a lot, is actually having a conversation at some point where let's just make it stereotype. Dad says to the eldest son, yeah, it's time I kind of moved into the cottage down the road, you take over. It's not half as easy as people I think hope and think, and often it never does happen, and so then you get a whole mess kind of to clear up afterwards. But there is quite a lot going on in this. A lot of sort of the agricultural colleges and others are looking how you improve succession, and certainly how you kind of bring in discussions into it. I think it might be, we will see some of this come to the fore in the next couple of years, because one of the things the government is looking at as part of this new policy reform it's going through, which I've spoken about, is the potential to provide farm businesses with a lump sum to enable them to move out of
step change sort of thing.
Yeah, move out of it. And essentially it is seen, it isn't framed as such, but there is an element to that which might be about succession, about helping people who've kind of coming towards the end of their careers actually make the choice. Often they've just not really been quite able to do that from a financial perspective. So the ability to maybe take a lump sum actually might provide the opportunity for them to do that. Either the next generation comes through, or even if it's a tenancy, the farm can go to be offered out to somebody else, or even it might be sold to a new entrant, depending. So I think that is quite an interesting potential change coming. It'll be a one-off moment, as it were, but it might just kind of incentivize a little bit of change. But it is a tricky one. There's lots of initiatives around skills and education, try and getting people into farming, into college, into studying it at college, so that they can take up those careers as well. But it's I haven't got an answer
I know, but those are good suggestions. And just out of interest, does the NFU engage actively in education as well?
Yeah, we do a couple of things. I mean, firstly, we engage actively with education at school level, so we provide quite a lot of materials for the curriculum, which is really important because there's lots of schools which they don't even touch on food and farming at all. They might have a little bit about environmentalism, a little bit about the outdoors, nature, etc. But quite often nothing about where food comes from, and I think that's quite kind of worrying in a way. So we do quite a lot of work to try and sort that out. But then at later stages, higher education, absolutely, we work with a number of the higher education institutions.
It's ecology, isn't it?
Yeah. It's not easy for some of those in recent years, to be honest. But trying to get people through that route into farming is important.
It does seem to me. I mean, maybe that's a place where sort of investment, because if you joined up radical thinking at that point, it would probably then transfer into the management subsequently. Because I think that sometimes there's a stewardship conversation going on, and then there's a sort of a evolution or sort of environment question going on, and the sort of two things seem to sort of somehow, for reasons probably historical rather than the present and future, sit in two different camps.
Absolutely. I mean, anecdotally, I often hear of farm businesses where, the dad has been doing it in a certain way for a long time, and the son will come into the business out of agricultural college, not taking it over, but brought in to assist, basically. It might be a joint partnership arrangement or even just something more informal, but he will come with a whole load of new ideas which he's picked out of agricultural college. A lot of those might be kicked away. But I do, as I say, anecdotally, you actually, and so we started doing things differently. We looked at things in a different way. It's like any business, let's be honest. It's like any business. If you've been doing something for 25, 30 years, you do it in your way. And bringing in fresh blood and a fresh pair of eyes can be really important. And actually, it can happen in a sort of almost a nicer way in farming, because it's often a family arrangement where you can bring in the next generation. I think the challenge is what happens kind of 5-10 years after that in terms of succession, and that's often a much more difficult kind of conversation.
No, I think those really are. But as you say, and probably like any business, frankly, it's what it needs is the capital to reinvest and get its own ideas. So we're very, very interesting. I think we're all very keenly focused on what the ELM is going to deliver, and if it's the government's going to act in the way that it's talking about, it should be a very exciting time. And let's hope they don't draw short. Nick, thank you very, very much.